Section 1. The woman who no longer existed. Sunlight streamed through the tall courtroom windows, painting long golden lines across polished wooden floors. Every seat in the gallery was occupied, yet an uneasy silence hung over the room. Reporters gripped their notebooks. Attorneys shuffled thick folders. At the center of it all stood a young woman whose steady gaze betrayed years of quiet suffering. The clerk called the case, and all eyes turned toward her. "Please state your full name for the record." She lifted her chin, her voice calm despite the storm raging inside her. "My name is Eleanor Whitmore." For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the judge lowered his glasses and looked down at the documents before him. "I'm sorry," he said slowly. "According to every official record before this court, you are not Eleanor Whitmore." A murmur swept through the courtroom. The woman's face drained of color. The judge continued, "The legal Eleanor Whitmore is already present." The heavy courtroom doors opened. Every head turned. A second woman entered, elegant and composed, escorted by her attorney. She wore a tailored black suit and carried herself with effortless confidence. As she approached the front of the courtroom, she offered a sympathetic smile that never reached her eyes. She looked directly at the woman standing before the judge. It was her younger sister. For a single, unbearable moment, neither woman spoke. The judge reviewed another page before delivering the words that shattered everything. "Miss Eleanor Whitmore has already been recognized as the sole surviving daughter of the late Richard Whitmore and the lawful heir to the Whitmore estate." The woman standing alone felt the room begin to spin. How could her own sister possess her name, her identity, her entire life? As whispers filled the courtroom, fragments of forgotten memories crashed back into her mind. A rain-soaked night. A funeral. Her father's casket disappearing beneath a sea of black umbrellas. Her mother's tear-stained face refusing to meet her eyes. Her sister standing silently in the doorway, watching. And then, the accusation. The screaming. A suitcase thrown onto the front steps. The front door slamming shut forever. She had walked away believing time would heal what grief had broken. She never imagined that while she struggled to survive, someone had quietly erased her from existence. Now, every document, every signature, every official record claimed she had never been the daughter she had always known herself to be. The battle for her family's fortune had only just begun. But first, she would have to prove that she was real. Section 2. Two sisters, one childhood, two different futures. Long before lawyers argued over signatures and judges questioned identities, the Whitmore family had been admired as one of the most respected names in the county. Their sprawling estate overlooked rolling green hills, its stone walls carrying generations of tradition, success, and quiet influence. To outsiders, it was the picture of a perfect family. Inside those walls, however, appearances concealed fractures that grew wider with every passing year. Richard Whitmore, the family patriarch, was a man known for his integrity. Though his business empire demanded much of his time, he never missed an opportunity to read bedtime stories, attend school performances, or remind his daughters that character mattered far more than wealth. His eldest daughter, Eleanor, cherished every moment with him. Curious, kind-hearted, and remarkably mature for her age, she naturally became the child everyone admired. Their mother, Margaret, was different. Elegant and composed in public, she valued reputation above affection. Praise was rare, warmth even rarer. She expected perfection from both daughters, but offered little comfort when they failed, creating an invisible distance that neither girl truly understood. For Eleanor's younger sister, Charlotte, living beside her older sibling felt like standing in permanent shadow. Teachers praised Eleanor's intelligence. Neighbors complimented her kindness. Even family friends would smile and say, "She's just like her father." Each compliment landed like another stone on Charlotte's heart. At first, the jealousy appeared harmless. Charlotte insisted on borrowing Eleanor's dresses, copied her hairstyle, and begged for identical birthday gifts. Adults laughed, calling it innocent admiration between sisters. But the behavior slowly changed. If Eleanor received a handmade necklace from their father, it would mysteriously disappear days later, only to be found hidden among Charlotte's belongings. When Eleanor won a school art competition, Charlotte secretly scratched the trophy before anyone could display it. Once, after Eleanor spent weeks caring for an injured songbird, the cage was discovered open one morning, the bird gone without a trace. Charlotte simply shrugged, insisting accidents happened. Each incident was small enough to dismiss, easy to forgive, and impossible to prove. Richard noticed the growing resentment and tried to bring his daughters closer together, believing love could heal what envy had quietly begun. But beneath Charlotte's polite smiles, something darker was taking root. She no longer wanted to share her sister's life. Deep inside, she had begun to imagine what it would be like to become her. Section 3. The night everything changed. Everything changed on a cold October evening. Richard Whitmore had left the estate before sunrise for what was supposed to be an ordinary business meeting in the city. He promised Eleanor he would return in time for her 18th birthday dinner that evening, smiling as he handed her a small velvet box. "Don't open it until I'm home," he said with a wink. "Some gifts mean more when they're given in person." It was the last conversation she would ever have with her father. Just after noon, 2 police officers drove slowly through the estate's iron gates. Their expressions alone told Margaret everything before a single word was spoken. Richard's car had been struck by a speeding truck on a rain-slick highway. He hadn't survived the impact. The Whitmore estate, once filled with laughter and certainty, fell into a silence so heavy it seemed to swallow every room. The funeral brought politicians, business leaders, and lifelong friends, all mourning a man respected by everyone who knew him. Yet behind the polished speeches and black attire, another battle had already begun. Without Richard's steady presence, Margaret became increasingly withdrawn, relying almost entirely on Charlotte for emotional support. Decisions that Richard would have questioned were now made behind closed doors, with Eleanor quietly excluded from every important conversation. Then came the fire. Late one stormy night, smoke poured from Richard's private study, the one room he had always kept meticulously organized. Family records, legal files, handwritten journals, and decades of personal documents were consumed before firefighters could bring the flames under control. Although investigators later suggested an electrical fault, Charlotte tearfully insisted she had seen Eleanor leaving the study only minutes before the fire started. Margaret, shattered by grief and desperate for someone to blame, believed her. The accusations spread through the family like poison. Relatives whispered that Eleanor had destroyed important papers. Old friends avoided her calls. Even the household staff looked at her differently, unsure whom to trust. Heartbroken and unable to convince anyone of her innocence, Eleanor packed a single suitcase and walked away from the only home she had ever known. She believed distance would calm everyone's anger and that one day the truth would surface. She couldn't have known that her departure was exactly what someone had been waiting for. As Eleanor struggled to build a quiet life under rented roofs and modest jobs, invisible hands began rewriting history. Birth certificates were quietly amended. School records vanished and reappeared under different names. Bank files, insurance documents, medical records, and even government databases were altered piece by piece. By the time Eleanor finally returned years later, the woman she had once been no longer existed on paper. Someone hadn't simply stolen her inheritance. They had spent years stealing her entire identity. Section 4. A funeral invitation that makes no sense. For nearly 12 years, Eleanor Whitmore built a life from the ruins of the one she had lost. She moved from one small town to another, taking whatever honest work she could find, waitressing, shelving books in a local library, assisting at a flower shop, and eventually managing a quiet antique store owned by an elderly widow who never questioned her past. She lived modestly in a one-bedroom apartment, keeping only a handful of belongings: a faded photograph of her father, the unopened velvet box he had given her on the morning of his death, and the hope that someday her family would realize the terrible mistake they had made. That hope had almost disappeared. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, a cream-colored envelope arrived in her mailbox. There was no return address. Only a single sentence was typed inside. "Jonathan Whitmore has passed away. His funeral will be held this Saturday. If you ever want the truth, come home. No signature. No explanation. Her grandfather, the man who had taught her how to ride horses through the estate's sprawling fields, who secretly slipped her peppermint candies during formal dinners, and who had once promised, "No matter what happens, you'll always have a place in this family." He had never contacted her after Richard's death. Or perhaps someone had made sure his letters never reached her. Unable to ignore the message, Eleanor packed a small suitcase and boarded the first train back to the county she had spent more than a decade trying to forget. Every passing mile stirred memories she had buried deep inside, her father's laughter echoing through the halls, childhood summers beneath ancient oak trees, and the night she walked away believing exile would only be temporary. By the time she reached the Whitmore estate, black cars already lined the long circular driveway. Mourners dressed in dark suits and elegant dresses filled the gardens, speaking in hushed voices beneath gray autumn skies. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor stepped through the gates. For a brief moment, everything felt familiar. Then she heard someone call her name. "Eleanor, dear, we're so sorry for your loss." She instinctively turned toward the voice. The words weren't meant for her. Standing beside her grandfather's casket was a beautifully dressed woman accepting condolences with graceful smiles. She wore the Whitmore family heirloom necklace. She greeted lifelong family friends as if she had never left. And when she slowly turned to face the entrance, Eleanor's heart stopped. It was Charlotte, her younger sister. But no one called her Charlotte anymore. Every guest, every relative, even the family's longtime attorney, addressed her by the only name Eleanor had ever known as her own, Eleanor Whitmore. As the room fell silent, confused eyes turned toward the unexpected stranger standing at the chapel doors. Before Eleanor could speak, a distant cousin frowned and whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'm sorry, who invited her?" In that single, crushing moment, Eleanor realized she wasn't returning home. She had walked into a world where she no longer belonged, and everyone believed she was the imposter. Section 5. Every door closes. The days following Jonathan Whitmore's funeral became a relentless battle against an invisible enemy. Eleanor believed the truth could be uncovered with something as simple as official records. After all, facts couldn't lie. Or so she thought. Her first stop was the county records office, where she requested a copy of her birth certificate. The clerk disappeared into a back room before returning with a neatly printed document. She stared at it in disbelief. The certificate belonged to Eleanor Grace Whitmore, but the date of birth, parents, and official registration all identified Charlotte as the legal daughter of Richard and Margaret Whitmore. "There must be some mistake," Eleanor whispered. The clerk looked at her sympathetically. "I'm afraid there isn't." Determined to prove otherwise, she visited her old elementary school. She remembered every hallway, every classroom, even the oak tree she had planted with her father during a school celebration. But the archived records told a different story. Every award she had won, every report card, every school photograph, all had been reassigned to Charlotte under the name Eleanor Whitmore. It was as if someone had rewritten her childhood one page at a time. Desperate, she searched for comfort among the people who had once watched her grow up. Her father's closest business partner hesitated before politely saying, "I'm sorry. I only remember one daughter named Eleanor." A former piano teacher looked genuinely confused. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else." Even neighbors who had once waved to her every morning avoided eye contact, unwilling to become involved in what now sounded like an unbelievable fantasy. The final blow came at the Whitmore National Bank. Eleanor requested access to the trust account her father had established for her 18th birthday. After verifying her identification, the manager's expression changed instantly. "This account belongs to Miss Eleanor Whitmore," he said cautiously. "And according to our records, she's already withdrawn from it for years." Security quietly escorted Eleanor outside before she could protest. Humiliated and running out of options, she reported the identity theft to the local police. Instead of opening an investigation, the detective studied her paperwork with growing suspicion. "Every government database confirms the same person," he said. "If anyone's using a false identity here, it appears to be you." For the first time since returning home, Eleanor questioned her own sanity. Had grief somehow distorted her memories? Was it possible every piece of evidence truly pointed against her? Late that evening, as she sat alone on a weathered park bench, an elderly groundskeeper slowly approached with the help of a wooden cane. His name was Samuel Brooks. He had served the Whitmore family for over 40 years before quietly retiring after Richard's death. Without introducing himself, he lowered himself onto the bench beside her. "I knew your father," he said softly, never taking his eyes off the setting sun. Then he turned toward Eleanor, his voice barely above a whisper. "They buried the truth years ago, Miss Eleanor." He paused, making certain no one was close enough to overhear. But they didn't bury all of it. For the first time since the nightmare began, a fragile spark of hope flickered back to life. Section 6. The Hidden Trail. Samuel Brooks refused to speak inside the town. "There are too many ears," he warned, glancing over his shoulder. "If they've watched you this long, they'll be watching now." Before sunrise the next morning, he led Eleanor to an abandoned gardener's cottage on the far edge of the Whitmore estate. Hidden beneath overgrown ivy and forgotten for years, it had once been Richard Whitmore's favorite place to escape the pressures of business. Dust covered every surface, but Samuel seemed to know exactly where he was going. He knelt beside an old stone fireplace and carefully removed a loose brick. From the hollow space behind it, he pulled out a weathered leather pouch tied with faded blue ribbon. "I promised your father I'd keep this hidden until the day you came back," he said. Inside were several handwritten letters, copies of legal correspondence, and a small notebook filled with Richard's meticulous observations. The first letter made Eleanor's hands tremble. "If you're reading this, something has gone terribly wrong." Richard wrote that he had begun noticing unusual discrepancies months before his death. Signatures on company documents appeared slightly altered. Family files had been accessed without permission. Even the household safe showed signs of being opened when only 3 people knew its combination. At first, he suspected simple fraud. Then he realized someone wasn't stealing money. They were stealing identity. The notebook contained dates, names, and brief notes beside each entry. One name appeared again and again: the family's longtime attorney, Charles Hargrove. Richard had written only 3 chilling words beside it. "Trusted too easily." As Eleanor sorted through the remaining papers, another discovery caught her attention. Several probate documents carried filing dates that were impossible. Some had been officially notarized weeks after Richard's death, yet bore signatures supposedly witnessed while he was still alive. The inconsistencies were too precise to be accidental. Whoever orchestrated this deception hadn't acted alone. Someone inside the legal system had helped rewrite history. While Eleanor and Samuel pieced together the puzzle, word quietly reached Charlotte that an old employee had been seen speaking with the woman claiming to be Eleanor. That evening, Charlotte remained perfectly composed as she poured herself a glass of wine. Only her eyes betrayed the panic growing beneath the surface. She picked up her phone and made a single call. "We have a problem," she said coldly. "They've found the first cache." A long silence followed before she spoke again. "No mistakes this time. Destroy everything that's left." As darkness settled over the estate, a fire erupted inside the county archive building. By morning, decades of legal records had been reduced to ash. Someone was no longer covering their tracks. They were racing against the truth itself. Section 7. The House That Refused to Forget. The fire at the county archives erased countless records, but instead of discouraging Eleanor, it confirmed her deepest suspicion. Someone was terrified of what she might uncover. Samuel believed there was only one place the conspirators had never completely controlled. "The old house remembers things people try to forget," he said quietly. "Your father trusted bricks more than people." Under the cover of a moonless night, they slipped onto the Whitmore estate through a neglected service entrance hidden behind rows of overgrown hedges. The once grand mansion stood silent against the dark sky, its towering windows reflecting only shadows. Though the estate was still occupied, an entire wing had remained locked since Richard Whitmore's death, abandoned after the mysterious fire that had scarred the family years before. Samuel produced an old iron key from his coat pocket. I kept this when everyone else surrendered theirs. The heavy door groaned as it opened. Dust floated through pale beams of moonlight, and the familiar scent of old wood and leather filled Eleanor's lungs. Every step stirred memories she had fought for years to bury. Portraits of long-dead ancestors still lined the hallway, watching silently as she returned to the home that had erased her existence. They made their way toward Richard's private study. The room looked exactly as Eleanor remembered: rows of mahogany bookshelves, a weathered globe in the corner, and her father's favorite leather chair positioned beside the fireplace. Time seemed to have frozen the moment he left for his final journey. Most people would have seen nothing unusual. Eleanor noticed what others couldn't. One book on the highest shelf was slightly misaligned. Her father had always insisted every book remain perfectly straight. She carefully reached for it. A quiet click echoed through the room. Part of the bookshelf shifted inward, revealing a narrow, hidden compartment concealed within the wall. Inside rested 3 leather-bound journals, a sealed wooden box, and several neatly wrapped bundles of letters protected inside oilcloth. Samuel smiled sadly. "I knew he'd hidden something," he whispered. "I just never knew where." The journals revealed Richard's growing fear that someone inside his own family was manipulating events behind his back. At first, he doubted his instincts, convincing himself grief, stress, and business pressures had clouded his judgment. But as the entries progressed, his handwriting became sharper, more urgent. He described confidential conversations that somehow reached outsiders within hours. Legal papers disappeared from locked drawers before mysteriously returning with subtle alterations. Financial statements no longer matched the originals he had signed. Most haunting of all was a journal entry dated only 2 weeks before his death. "If anything happens to me, Eleanor must never trust appearances. They may steal documents, rewrite records, and even convince the world she never existed. But truth leaves fingerprints that lies can never completely erase." Eleanor struggled to steady her breathing as she opened the sealed wooden box. Inside lay the velvet gift her father had promised to give her on her 18th birthday. She had carried the unopened box with her for 12 years, believing it contained nothing more than a sentimental keepsake. Now, she realized there had always been 2 identical boxes. The one in her apartment, and the one hidden inside the wall. Whatever Richard had left behind, he had never intended it to be found until his true daughter came searching for the truth. And Eleanor was finally standing exactly where he had always hoped she would. Section 8. The secret hidden inside the will. The hidden journals proved that Richard Whitmore had suspected betrayal long before his death, but Eleanor still lacked the one thing a court would demand above all else: undeniable legal evidence. Samuel carefully unfolded one final document from the wooden box. It was only half of a will. The lower portion had been torn away with deliberate precision, leaving several sentences unfinished. Yet even in its damaged state, it revealed something astonishing. The document was dated 6 months before Richard's fatal accident and carried the signatures of 2 witnesses. More importantly, it contained a handwritten note in Richard's unmistakable script. "The inheritance shall not pass solely by name, nor by public record." Eleanor read the sentence again, hardly believing her eyes. Below it, another paragraph survived despite the missing pages. "My rightful daughter alone knows the promise she made to me beneath the old cedar tree. Should any dispute arise regarding identity, the fulfillment of that promise shall unlock the final instruction entrusted to my attorney." Eleanor's heart pounded. The old cedar tree. Instantly, she was transported back to a warm summer afternoon when she was 12 years old. She and her father had buried a small metal time capsule beneath the estate's oldest cedar after he told her that real wealth wasn't measured by money, but by the lives a person changed. Before covering the capsule with earth, he had asked her to make one promise. "No matter how much this family owns," he had said, "if one day it's all yours, promise you'll use part of it to help people we'll never meet." She had smiled, placed her tiny hand in his, and made the promise. No one else had been there. Not Margaret. Not Charlotte. Only father and daughter. Richard had built the condition into his estate because it could never be forged. It wasn't hidden in a document. It lived inside a memory. As Eleanor struggled to absorb the revelation, another folded page slipped from the damaged will. It referenced a sealed instruction entrusted to the family's attorney, Charles Hargrove, to be opened only if the rightful heir proved knowledge of the private covenant. Samuel's expression darkened. If Hargrove followed your father's wishes, that instruction could expose everything. Across town, Charlotte sat alone in Richard's former office, staring at a message that had just arrived on her phone. They found part of the original will. For the first time in years, her composure cracked. Her hands trembled as she read the words again. If Eleanor reached Hargrove before she did, the carefully constructed lie that had protected her for 12 years could collapse overnight. Charlotte stood abruptly, grabbed her car keys, and rushed into the night. She no longer intended to defend the deception. She intended to bury the last remaining truth before anyone else could uncover it. Section 9. Someone wanted her silent. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Eleanor understood that the fight was no longer about reclaiming her inheritance. It was about staying alive long enough to tell the truth. She and Samuel drove to Charles Hargrove's law office, hoping to confront the attorney before Charlotte reached him. But as they pulled into the parking lot, flashing police lights surrounded the building. A uniformed officer stopped them at the entrance. "I'm sorry," he said solemnly. "Mr. Hargrove suffered a severe heart attack late last night. He was transferred to the hospital before dawn." The timing felt far too convenient. When Eleanor asked where the sealed instructions from Richard Whitmore were being kept, the officer simply shrugged. "The office was cleared before we arrived." Every file relating to the Whitmore estate had vanished. Someone had reached Hargrove first. The danger escalated that same afternoon. Samuel arranged a meeting with one of Richard's former accountants, a quiet man named Daniel Mercer, who had hinted years earlier that certain financial statements never made sense. They agreed to meet at a small roadside cafe outside town. Daniel never arrived. Instead, Eleanor received a frantic phone call. "I'm sorry," a trembling waitress whispered. "He left 20 minutes ago after someone warned him not to speak with you." No one saw where he went. No one heard from him again. The message was unmistakable. Anyone willing to help Eleanor was becoming a target. Determined not to retreat, Eleanor accepted an unexpected offer from Claire Donovan, an investigative journalist who had quietly followed the Whitmore family's influence for years. The strange inheritance dispute had caught her attention, but it was the mysterious archive fire that convinced her something far darker was unfolding. Unlike the local authorities, Claire trusted evidence more than reputation. Using public financial databases, corporate filings, and forgotten court archives from neighboring counties, she uncovered a pattern hidden beneath decades of paperwork. Payments disguised as consulting fees had flowed from Whitmore family accounts into shell companies controlled by individuals connected to Charles Hargrove. Notaries who had authenticated suspicious legal documents later received unusually large deposits. Even a retired records supervisor had purchased an expensive vacation home shortly after Eleanor disappeared from official files. The conspiracy wasn't the work of one desperate sister. It was an organized network of respected professionals who had quietly profited from rewriting a woman's identity. That evening, Claire handed Eleanor a folder containing certified copies of the financial transactions. "We're getting close," she said. "Close enough that they're making mistakes." Moments later, as Eleanor drove back towards Samuel's cottage, a black SUV appeared in her rearview mirror. It stayed close. Too close. The road curved sharply along a steep hillside. Without warning, the SUV accelerated. It slammed into the back of Eleanor's car with crushing force. Her tires screamed across the pavement as the vehicle spun toward the edge of the cliff. For one terrifying instant, she stared over the guardrail at the rocks far below. Someone wasn't trying to frighten her anymore. Someone wanted the last true Eleanor Whitmore to disappear forever. Section 10. The truth buried for 20 years. Major reveal. Eleanor regained consciousness to the shrill sound of twisting metal. Her car hung precariously against the damaged guardrail, its front wheels suspended over the rocky cliff below. Blood trickled from a cut above her eyebrow as she struggled to unfasten her seatbelt. Moments later, passing motorists rushed to help, pulling her to safety only seconds before the vehicle slipped free and plunged into the ravine. It was no accident. The police called it reckless driving. Claire Donovan called it attempted murder. And Eleanor finally understood that the truth they were chasing was powerful enough to make desperate people abandon every pretense of innocence. 3 days later, a breakthrough arrived from the most unexpected source. Charles Hargrove had survived his heart attack. Still weak but burdened by years of guilt, the elderly attorney secretly requested a meeting with Eleanor, Claire, and Samuel inside his hospital room. He insisted the conversation remain off the record until he finished speaking. With trembling hands, he opened a sealed envelope that had remained hidden inside a private safety deposit box for nearly 2 decades. "I should have done this years ago," he whispered. Richard knew something terrible was coming. Inside the envelope was a notarized affidavit signed by Richard Whitmore only weeks before his death, along with a handwritten letter addressed specifically to his eldest daughter. As Eleanor unfolded the pages, her father's familiar handwriting seemed to bring his voice back to life. "If you are reading this, then my greatest fear has become reality. Someone I loved chose ambition over family." Richard revealed that months before the fatal accident, he had discovered Margaret and Charlotte secretly meeting with Charles Hargrove and a senior official from the county records office. At first, Margaret believed they were simply restructuring family assets to protect the estate after Richard's declining health. Charlotte, however, had a far more sinister plan. She convinced her grieving mother that Eleanor blamed the family for every tragedy and would eventually sell the Whitmore estate, destroy generations of tradition, and leave Margaret with nothing. Fear slowly replaced reason. Margaret agreed to transfer legal authority over several family records temporarily, until probate was complete. She never realized those signatures became the foundation of an elaborate identity theft. Birth certificates were amended. School files were substituted. Medical histories were reassigned. Financial trusts were rewritten. Government databases were quietly altered one department at a time. What began as deception became an entirely new legal identity. Richard confronted Hargrove immediately after discovering the forged documents, demanding the fraud be reversed. But Hargrove, terrified of exposing his own role and pressured by influential accomplices, delayed every attempt to correct the records. Sensing that his time might be running out, Richard prepared for the worst. The handwritten letter ended with one final instruction. "The last proof is not in this envelope. I placed it where only you would ever think to look, the place where your mother cried, where you said goodbye to me, and where no one else ever returned." Eleanor froze. She knew exactly what he meant. The burned remains of Richard's private study. The fireplace. The spot where she had knelt after the fire, silently promising that she would never let his memory disappear. Returning to the ruined room that very evening, Eleanor carefully examined the cracked stone hearth. Remembering how her father had taught her to notice imperfections, she pressed against a loose granite slab hidden beneath the ashes. With a dull grinding sound, a concealed compartment slowly opened. Inside rested a fireproof metal case. Protected from flames, moisture, and time, it contained the original birth certificates, untouched family registry books, Richard's unaltered final will, authenticated DNA reports, and dozens of signed affidavits documenting every forged transaction and every person involved in the conspiracy. There was no room left for doubt. The evidence was absolute. Within hours, Claire delivered copies to federal investigators. Before sunrise, arrest warrants were issued for corrupt officials, fraudulent notaries, and financial accomplices whose names had remained hidden for nearly 20 years. The fight for an inheritance was over. A criminal conspiracy had finally been exposed. Now, only one battle remained: to reclaim the name that had been stolen from Eleanor Whitmore. Section 11. The Courtroom of Truth. The courtroom was even more crowded than it had been on the day Eleanor was told she no longer existed. News cameras lined the courthouse steps before sunrise. Reporters from across the country packed the gallery, eager to witness what had become one of the most extraordinary inheritance fraud cases in recent history. The once respected Whitmore family name had become synonymous with deception, corruption, and betrayal. This time, however, Eleanor did not stand alone. Samuel Brooks sat quietly in the front row, his weathered hands folded across his cane. Claire Donovan occupied the press section, her investigation having exposed the network of conspirators long before the arrests were made. Charles Hargrove, visibly older and weakened by illness, waited to testify under oath, prepared at last to tell the truth he had buried for nearly 2 decades. One by one, the evidence was presented. Experts authenticated Richard Whitmore's original will and confirmed that the documents recovered from the fireproof case predated every altered record introduced after his death. Forensic document examiners demonstrated how signatures had been copied, pages substituted, and official seals fraudulently reproduced. Digital specialists traced unauthorized changes across government databases, revealing a carefully coordinated scheme that unfolded over several years rather than a single act of forgery. Each revelation dismantled another piece of the fabricated identity. Then came the DNA analysis. Independent experts compared preserved medical records from Richard with new samples collected under court supervision. The scientific findings left no room for argument. Eleanor was Richard Whitmore's eldest biological daughter. The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Charlotte's attorney attempted to challenge the evidence, insisting his client had merely relied on records she believed to be genuine. But the prosecution introduced financial transfers, private correspondence, and phone records linking Charlotte directly to meetings with corrupt officials long before the identity changes began. The contradictions became impossible to escape. Charlotte claimed she had never entered the county records office. Security logs placed her there repeatedly. She denied meeting with notaries. Signed visitor books proved otherwise. She insisted the inheritance had always been hers. Richard's handwritten journals told a very different story. At last, Charlotte lowered her head. She offered no further answers. The judge carefully reviewed the final exhibits before addressing the courtroom. Identity is not created by forged documents, he said solemnly. It is established by truth. With the strike of his gavel, the court declared every fraudulent amendment null and void. The legal identity of Eleanor Grace Whitmore was fully restored. The original will was reinstated. The Whitmore estate was returned to its rightful heir. At the same time, prosecutors formally filed criminal charges against Charlotte, Margaret, Charles Hargrove's surviving accomplices, the corrupt records officials, and every individual who had knowingly participated in the decades-long conspiracy. For the first time in 20 years, Eleanor's name belonged to her again. Not because the court had given it back, because the truth had finally caught up with the lie. Section 12. The name that could never be stolen. 6 months later, spring returned to the Whitmore estate. The once silent gardens bloomed with fresh color, their winding paths alive again with birdsong and laughter. Workers carefully restored the old mansion stone by stone, preserving its history while repairing the scars left by years of neglect. The estate no longer felt like a monument to betrayal. It felt like home again. Although the court had awarded Eleanor ownership of everything that had rightfully belonged to her, she found little satisfaction in the size of the fortune. Too much had been lost to celebrate money alone. No judgment could return the years stolen from her, the birthdays spent in loneliness, or the memories her father never had the chance to make with her. Instead of selling the estate or locking its gates behind wealth and privilege, Eleanor chose a different future. She established the Richard Whitmore Foundation, dedicating a significant portion of the inheritance to scholarships for students who had lost parents, legal assistance for victims of identity fraud, and grants supporting children's literacy programs throughout the county. It was the promise she had made beneath the old cedar tree. A promise finally fulfilled. The library inside the mansion, once hidden behind fear and deception, was transformed into a community learning center where children gathered every afternoon to read, study, and dream. Richard's private study remained largely untouched, not as a shrine to grief, but as a quiet reminder that courage often begins with a single person refusing to surrender the truth. Margaret accepted responsibility for her role in the conspiracy and quietly withdrew from public life, carrying the weight of her choices with genuine remorse. Charlotte faced the consequences imposed by the court, her years of deception ending not with triumph, but with the painful realization that stealing another person's identity had ultimately cost her her own. One warm evening, Eleanor stood beneath the towering cedar tree overlooking the estate. The same gentle breeze that had rustled its branches when she was a little girl now carried the sounds of children laughing across the gardens. She smiled as she placed her hand against the weathered trunk. Names could be forged on paper. Fortunes could be stolen through greed. Lies could survive for years behind polished smiles and official seals. But truth possessed a quiet strength that deception could never match. It waited patiently. It endured. And when the time was right, it always found its way into the light. As the camera slowly pulled away, the restored Whitmore estate stood not as a symbol of wealth, but of redemption. The setting sun bathed the ancient stone walls in golden light, while Eleanor looked toward the horizon with peace instead of bitterness. Her greatest inheritance had never been the mansion, the land, or the fortune left behind. It was the courage to fight for who she truly was. Because in the end, a name may be stolen from documents, but it can never be stolen from the truth.